Hello and welcome to this episode of the GOTO podcast. I'm Joel Humble. I'm a freelance techie editor, author and consultant, and this is the third in a mini-series of podcasts that I'm doing for GOTO, talking to engineering leaders. I'm aiming for each episode to have actionable insights and suggestions for further research, such as books and papers to read, conference talks to watch, and so on. And for this episode, I'm particularly thrilled to be joined by Gene Kim, because I think he is one of the very best communicators and teachers and explainers we have in our industry. And I have personally learned so much from both his writing and his conference talks. Gene is a Wall Street Journal bestselling author, researcher, and multi-award-winning CTO. He's been studying high-performing technology organizations since 1999, was the founder and CTO of Tripwire for 13 years, and he is the author or co-author of 6 books, including the Unicorn Project, the Phoenix Project, Accelerate, and the DevOps Handbook. Since 2014, he's also been the founder and organizer of DevOps Enterprise Summit, and his most recent book is Wiring Your Winning Organization, which he co-wrote with Dr. Stephen Spear. Spear is perhaps best known for his work decoding the DNA of Toyota production system and learning to lead at Toyota, both of which were published originally on HBR, and which have become sort of part of the vocabulary, I think, for high-performing organizations. Between them, Gene and Stephen have spent some 60 years studying organizations across every industry vertical, including surveying 36,000 organizations and gathering case studies from over 500 of them, which is in itself, I think, just astonishing. Gene, welcome to the show.
Hey, Charles, I'm so delighted to be here, and I'm just pleased to be in such amazing company of this amazing series. So, yeah, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute honor. I'm fascinated by how you and Stephen ended up working on this book together. What brought the two of you together?
Oh, yeah. So I remember reading the that famous Harvard Business Review article, and it must have been the early 2000s. And I remember being with actually a co-author of the Phoenix Project, Kevin Baer. We were I remember we were in Atlanta together, and we were studying the paper together, reading it, actually listening to an audio version of it, and we were just dazzled by it. And so I actually got to meet him in person when I took a workshop from him at MIT Sloan School of Business, and it changed my life. I mean, in fact, sometimes I joke that the DevOps Handbook was a year later than it should have been, just because there was so much I had learned that I felt were so important that needed to get into the book. And so we had been corresponding and interacting for some years, and this notion of writing a book together, it really came from this quest that we've been on, we both want to understand, why do organizations work the way they do, both in the ideal and not ideal? And then what is in common between things like Agile and DevOps and the Toyota production system and Lean, and for that matter, resilience engineering, safety culture, Western organizational typology model. And what was so fun, and our conclusion is that they're all incomplete expressions of a far greater, but also far simpler whole. And it was just such an exhilarating experience working with Steve, because we come from such different backgrounds. I mean, I don't think it's made in a book, but to oversimplify, I come from software. He comes from hardware. He studied manufacturing, safety cultures. He has a training in economics. And it was just so fun to be able to really try to study what are the mechanisms that work, and why is there such convergent evolution in all of these domains? To something that despite a different background, we can recognize there are similarities and common forces at work. So it was such a fun project. It was the most intellectually challenging thing I've ever worked on in my whole career, but also one of the most rewarding, just because I just learned so much.
It's always joyful, I think, working with someone who thinks a bit differently from you, and maybe gets your own brain working in a slightly new way, or a stimulating way.
Absolutely.
I'd characterize a lot of your work as being around how you create a learning organization. So things like psychological safety, which is you have as the fourth of the 5 ideals of the Unicorn Project, and reducing the cost of it, running experiments and all that sort of thing. Would you kind of agree with that as a broad characterization? And if you do, how does that sort of fit with Stephen's work?
Yeah, in fact, that's a stunning and startling question, because I think you put your finger on really some of the most surprising commonalities when you look at, say, DevOps and the Toyota production system, is that you do have this characteristic of psychological safety, but really meaning that everyone is able to be solving tough problems all the time and really fully supported by leaders. That there is a system that's loosely coupled so that you have a low cost of experimentation, And and that's actually some of the core concepts. And I think for me, one of the things I'm just most proud of in the book is that there's a couple of metaphors that we use that really describe these kind of sometimes difficult concepts. For example, coupling. Right? I've spent 25 years trying to understand what is coupling really, and why is it so bad to be tightly coupled, and what are the properties that allow you to be loosely coupled. And so, if you don't mind, can I just give you like a 2-minute performance art version of like how I finally started to understand why coupling is bad and what constitutes it? The metaphor that we use in the book is Steve and Jean moving a couch. And I love this because it's, on first glance, it's kind of trivial, right? It's all brawn work. There's no problem solving. It's not cognitive problem solving. And yet they, Steve and Jean, have to solve a couple, not obvious problems, like where exactly is the center of gravity, around which axis do you have to rotate to get through a narrow doorway or to get through a narrow winding staircase, who should go first, and, should they face forwards or backwards? And, they don't need focus groups or consultants, just by picking up the couch, fast feedback, experimentation, and most importantly, communication and coordination, right? They will figure out answers to those problems. And yet as leaders, we can do many things to make their work difficult or maybe even impossible, like turning off the lights, right? Suddenly it will take longer. It's more dangerous. They can damage the couch themselves, right? And it will take longer, So that's not so good. But what's also interesting is that we can also introduce a lot of background noise, like a loud siren, loud music. And this actually introduces a different dimension of difficulty, which is that they now have difficulty, Steve and Jean now have difficulty communicating and coordinating. And so we can even put in an intermediary, right, that prevents Steve and Jean from talking directly with each other, right? Say going through Jira work tickets or work orders or account managers or lawyers. And suddenly it is not so preposterous to think that Steve and Jean will not be able to move that couch. And so, and I think this is exactly what caused the DevOps movement, right? Is that, the information flow required so far, between dev and ops, to do, say, a deployment, so far outstripped the communication channel between them that it forced this kind of reorganization where Steve and Jean, instead of going through work tickets, now work directly with each other. And I think this is really the couch of the metaphor for joint cognition and joint problem solving. And really what's the key notion here is coupling. When Steve and Jean moving a couch, they are inherently coupled together, right? Whatever affects Jean affects Steve and vice versa. And so that's the nature of many types of work. But often, when you're having to have, say, 3,000 people also coupled to the couch, no one has independence of action. And so the best they can do is, cut the couch into smaller pieces, right? So that you liberate them to work independently of each other. And then that's very familiar to us in software architecture. But it turns out this is actually common. And this is what enables the Toyota production system to work. That the famous Toyota andon cord, right? The reason why you can pull the cord and you don't stop the entire line, right? It's not all coupled together. It stops the line segment. And if it's not fixed in within 55 seconds, it will stop a larger segment, right? Because it is a hierarchical system. And so that is the decoupling of the work system that allows such massive experimentation and resilience of the production line. Anyway, so I think for me, I'm hoping that this will. Now everywhere, I've boiled on problems about is it too large of a couch or is it too small of a couch, right? And is there? And so the cousin of coupling is coherence. If things are not adequately coupled together, you don't have people able to work as a unified whole. Anyway, so that's one of the key ideas. Can I give you one more, Charles? Just because you had mentioned psychological safety. So I'm a huge fan of Dr. Ron Westrum, and he's one of those people who, when I met, it was just so great because he did so much to inform the state of DevOps research that I got to work on with Dr. Nicole Forsgren and Jez Humble. And the whole notion of like pathological cultures, bureaucratic cultures, and generative cultures, so great. But as he said, culture is often viewed as gossamer and ethereal, right? And so it's kind of difficult to know what to do with it. And so the metaphor that we use in the Wiring the Winning Organization book is that we say it's all about signals. It's something that engineers can understand. It's about signal generation, transmission, most important, reception, right? Communication, you always measure success by the receiver, right? And then corrective actions taken, and then confirmation that it solved the problem. And I love this because it can articulate all the ideas, that the Western organizational typology model, but it's easier to diagnose, right? Is it a signal generation problem, or is it a transmission problem? Is it a reception problem where, like, if it's not safe to tell bad news, right? No one's going to transmit those signals, right? Is it a prioritization problem? Is it a confirmation problem? And I think this has just a lot more power, and it's also something that engineers are very familiar with. And so as software professionals, right, I think it gives us a lot of tools to solve very, very important problems. Charles, how am I doing?
I think that's great. I also found, as I was reading the book, I was making connections to one of the other ideals from the Unicorn Project, which is the locality and simplicity. And that, to me, seems to kind of connect to the book as well in quite a sort of strong way, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, without a doubt. In fact, I think you had mentioned the Unicorn Project before. And for me, the Unicorn Project was so fun, right? So many people, they're familiar with the Phoenix Project, right? And really, that's really kind of the told from the story of the ops leader, right? And the Unicorn Project is the same story retold from the perspective of a developer. And it was just so fun. It was like a really meant to be a grand thought experiment about how bad of an architecture can we create, where you can take the best, 10x engineer, right? The best engineer in the organization, maroon them in the Phoenix Project, and suddenly they can't do anything, can't build, can't test, doesn't have license keys, doesn't have approvals, can't get logs, can't get, right? Everything is so difficult. And I think it was really just this amazing thought experiment of what prevents people from doing their work easily and well, right? And I think that's a hallmark of great architecture, is that, and the hallmark of great leaders is that they create these systems that allow people to be productive, to do their work easily and well, to have independence of action, so they're not coupled to everyone else in the organization, and it also allows them to do their work safely. So, I think I'm so glad. I'm not sure if I could have, the Wiring the Winning Organization would have been. If I would have known enough, had we not gone through the whole experiment of like really understanding like what are the things that prevent us from doing the things that we want to do, even small things now require heroic effort. How am I doing, Charles?
Yeah, no, that's good. I think something that I particularly loved, because although I'd experienced it firsthand, I don't think I'd ever really thought about it, was the idea of applying locality and simplicity to data. So I think we've got very used to the idea of spending a huge amount of time and effort on, developer productivity at the code level, but maybe rather less at the data level. It's like, that was a real light bulb moment for me, actually.
Actually, so much of it, like I've been playing with LLMs, and so much of this is like it actually looks like ELT transformations, right? And so and my favorite scene in the Unicorn Project is like during the disastrous deployment, there's a byte order marker in the file, which Jez Humble did that to me in one of the State of DevOps research, where basically all the data went missing because what's that? Dr. Nicole Forsgren. She gave me a file with like a byte order mark, which basically makes all of the columns disappear. So that happened in the Unicorn Project, and basically all the prices disappear from the e-commerce site. So that never happens, right?
No, press the fault. We've never had those moments in our way. So in the new book, in the Wiring the Winning Organizations book, you talk about these three layers. You have layer one, which is the technical object being worked on, or as it may be studied. Layer two, which is the tools used to do the work. And then layer three, which you talk about as being social circuitry. And that, as I understand it, is essentially the processes and procedures through which ideas and information flow. I really enjoyed that analogy, but I was interested in kind of how you arrived at it and why you used circuitry as your analogy for that.
So that was Steve's. I was initially a bit skeptical. I was like, why are we talking about this? But then he repeated something that he had told me once before, and it just, my head blew up. And it's this. It's that hospital systems are like right now notorious. Emergency departments are notorious for like, long wait times, missed handoffs, accidents, injuries, fatalities. And this apparently wasn't the case in the 1950s. And his observation was this, is that in the 1950s, a hospital system was actually somewhat simple, right? You had basically two silos, doctors and nurses, and you didn't have much technology, right? So there was no layer 2. You had basically x-rays and so forth, but not a lot more. And so you could get away with a very simple, layer 3 circuitry, right? Because the responsibility of integrating those functional disciplines wasn't too challenging. Fast forward 70 years, and now there are hundreds of functional specialties. Just among clinicians, you have about 20 functional specialties and growing. You have doctors, nurses, pharmacy, supply chain, and there's a lot more technology. So it used to be called radiology, right? X-ray, but now it's CAT scans and MRI machines, and then blood tracers. And so now you have a lot more layer 2. And so think about how much more sophisticated and how much more that layer 3 social circuitry must do. And so I love this Winston Churchill quote, "We shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us." We shape the architecture and the layer 3 wiring, and forever after, without dramatic intervention, right? Forever after, it shapes us. And so one of the top findings in the state of DevOps research was that architecture was one of the top predictors of performance. And so architecture is, a manifestation of this layer 3 wiring. And it just, the 3 layers did is isolate, whenever you have a longitudinal case study where an organization goes from worst to first, layer 1 and layer 2 are the same people, same technology, same floor space. The only thing that changed that resulted in this dramatic difference in performance is all in layer 3, in the management system, in the layer 3 wiring that leaders create. And so it became suddenly it went from, Steve, I just don't know about this, to, how incredible that is to be able to isolate, what changed in these organizations, right? That allows for such difference in outcomes. And so I think one of the lessons that we really try to put in the book is that you as a leader are responsible for the layer 3 wiring that everyone works within. And so if you have created an organization where, small efforts require superheroic efforts, massive escalations, lots of cajoling and scavenging, right? That is really your fault, right? And it's your responsibility, to create one where, people can get the right things at the right time from the right people in the right format, when they need it. And these are all kind of hallmarks of great wiring. So it's, I think one of the things I'm just super proud of that made it into the book that just clarifies so much.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And I think it's one of those things where we talk a lot about sort of organizational culture, but that always feels a bit kind of woolly and ill-defined. And one of the things I really liked about the circuitry sort of analogy is suddenly I know what I'm looking at now.
Yeah.
It's a really lovely clarification, I think. I do think that insight you have of, essentially leaders who pay attention to that circuitry are the ones who will do, or are the ones whose organizations will do best. I think that's such a key insight. It's really worth emphasizing.
But maybe just two things I just found really kind of amazing working with Steve. One, he had this kind of logical proof point, to your that really proves what you just said. You said, you don't have to get to very large of an organization where the leader's role is not kind of direct contribution of kind of labor or problem solving, right? That's really, it's a pretty screwed up organization when the leader is doing all the work and all the thinking, right? That defeats the whole purpose of an organization. So if that's true, you take it to its logical conclusion. It means that the leader is responsible for creating the conditions for people to do their best work. How can you argue with that? I mean, that's absolutely true, right? And so if you agree on that, then suddenly that, suddenly makes evident and makes obvious, things like, empowerment or, frontline empowerment or psychological safety or whatever. You can start to draw a direct line from, that point, right, to all the things that leaders need to do. So that's one. And then the notion of social circuitry, that I was a little bit resistant to. I just social security. I like organizational wiring, but he convinced me that he said circuits that whether it's a mechanical circuit or hydraulic circuit, its job is to get things to where they are to where they need to go, right? And so that explains why, like in a poorly run, poorly wired organization, no one has what they need ever, right? And even when they get it, it's like in the wrong format. And so that's a function of the wiring. So, it was not just figurative, but I think very much metaphorical.
Right. Yes. Yeah. As I say, I really like it. Can you talk a bit about the danger zone and the winning zone and how that sort of connects in?
Yeah, you're right. So, basically, just think of the worst conditions, where you have to solve really tough problems, right? I think in our world, you do it in production, right? When there's an immense amount of pressure and you have no ability to undo, right? Everything. But if you make one small mistake, basically it cascades outwards and causes everything to fail. That's important because if you can't iterate, it means you can't learn, right? Learning is experimental, it's iterative. What else can we do to make it more difficult? You can't see what you're doing, right? Everything you do, you can never see what the outcomes are, or it's like 5 minutes later or hours later, right? And so those are absolutely kind of the worst conditions that one can solve problems in. And so the job of layer 3 wiring is to get us into this from dangerous territory into kind of the winning territory, which means, you don't do the most dangerous work in production, you do it in planning and practice, right? And it's under those conditions where you actually have time to activate kind of a slower, more deliberative process of your brain, right? It's more creative. This is where you come up with novel solutions. You can red team, you can do tabletop exercises, right? Chaos engineering, all that. And we call that slowification. Then there's simplification. You change the nature of the problems themselves. Instead of a tightly coupled problem where everything's connected to everything, right? And you change one thing and random things fail, right? You start partitioning the problems, right? Both across time, right? You can do them in smaller batches, in space by modularizing, or even kind of sequentializing. And then amplifying, right? Just make sure that you have sort of vibrant, dynamic feedback loops that are giving feedback to the right people quickly all the time. That helps them learn, right? Helps us all learn. So we use the danger zone, winning zone to really articulate kind of these characteristics of what everyone should acknowledge are like either great ways to solve problems or terrible ways to solve problems. And then the three mechanisms of slowification, simplification, and amplification are really mechanisms, to move us from one zone to the other.
Yeah, and again, I really like those three mechanisms. I kind of naturally latched onto the slowification word because I'm a word nerd, and you invented a new word. Which I kind of really enjoyed. I found myself thinking there must be a word already for this, but I couldn't come up with one, and presumably you couldn't either, which is why you ended up inventing it.
Yeah, in fact, there's we're very thoughtful. We were not making up a word we don't do lightly, but our observation was that there's no one English word that seemed to sort of encapsulate this notion of making a short-term investment for a longer-term gain, right? We go slower to eventually go faster. And so what's interesting is that we have a lot of adages for this, like stop sawing to sharpen the saw, or like slow down to speed up. The Germans have a word like Verbesserung. That's pretty close. There's another longer word that's maybe even more complete. But I think our notion was that there's a school of thought that says if you can't say it, you can't think it. And so we wanted to create this word really to embody this concept so that we can trigger more moments of like, oh my gosh, so we're in a condition that we have lost kind of sight of what's going on, and we're actually entering the danger zone. Maybe we should actually slowify, right, so that we can do things in a more deliberate way to activate a different type of thinking. So yeah, that's our justification for having to make up a word.
Yeah, and again, I really like this idea of pulling problem solving out of the realm of execution effectively. It's really rare that organizations do that. But I think it's really crucial. I found myself, sort of Bill Gates famously used to have some think weeks back in the day.
Yeah,
where
you told me about that. Yeah,
off with a stack of papers and sit and read and think thoughts. And I was kind of thinking of that as well. This, as I say, so often you're dealing with the execution, you're dealing with the day-to-day, and you don't get time to step back and reflect and think, what can I do? I also made the connection to Thinking Fast and Slow, the Daniel Kahneman. I'm probably mispronouncing his surname. Sorry,
no, that's right. Dr. Daniel Kahneman and Dr. Amos Tversky, right, who was a collaborator on that incredible body of work.
Yeah. So again, would you make the connection? Is that connection valid, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And, I think the direct line that we would make to that incredible work is that, just like humans have kind of System 1 and System 2, System 1 being the faster, more instinctual, biased way of thinking, right? But also much more energy efficient, right? Versus System 2, which is, actually tough to kick in, right? It's much more energy intensive, and it's tough to actually slow down and be logical. And what we're saying is that, in organizational work, there is a fast moving work where, you're in flow, you're locked in, you're, this flow, like in the Mihaly, Chief Mihaly, right? You're, thousands of times more productive because you're in the zone. That's, or in a fast moving environment, you've rehearsed the routines, but that's actually not the mode that you need to be in to actually develop the routines. And by the way, and it's actually just to share, I haven't told anyone this, but one of the big kind of surprises to me was that I wrote the Apollo 11 moon landing. There's like 24 case studies, and I took the first draft of the moon landing one, where basically this is where Neil Armstrong gets the 1201 error codes on descent, like was it 60,000 feet above the lunar surface, which and actually it turns out his display blanked for I think it was like 15 seconds. And the narrative goes, right, that they had actually rehearsed that drill before. The simulation supervisor actually had set up these amazing drills to kind of rehearse, outlandish scenarios, right? So this would probably be recognizable to anyone in the chaos engineering community. But I had written down something that Steve flagged as like, that can't be possible. Basically, in the drill, I had written that, when they found out the 1201 error code, that the computer specialist was kind of flipping through the binders and trying to make a call of whether they should abort or not. He had mistakenly aborted. But I thought that they also had on the line the team at MIT Lincoln Labs who wrote the computer software. I'm sorry, it's the MIT something labs. But Steve said, no, that's impossible, right? There's no way that in that fast-moving simulation environment, they would have had time to make a call to the engineer, Don Iles, right, to ask him, did you know this could happen? Because it's too fast-moving. So just to even recognize that when you're in the production environment, there are real limitations about, who you can communicate with, who's making decisions, because if it involves trying to find someone 2,000 miles away, right, even with the internet, they are out of the loop. And so it's turns out like in Apollo 14, right, Don Iles was in the loop, but it was because it had to be resolved not in minutes, but in hours. And so I think there's a lot of things to learn just by kind of recognizing the limitations of what you can do in fast performance mode versus, something that is a slower mode where we can actually do some planning and preparation. How am I doing, Charles?
Yeah. No, I think that's, again, I really like that. I think something that our industry has been very prone to is cargo culting. So in my consulting, I've seen this with things like adopting microservices where, we want to adopt microservices because Netflix, but we haven't really spent the time to stop and, but we haven't really stopped to spend the time to stop and think about, the organizational aspects of them and even what they're for, or maybe some of the ceremonies around Agile or the Spotify model or whatever. And again, something I was quite struck by, and I don't know if this was a sort of deliberate thing, but I was just curious about it, was you seem to spend a lot of time in this book effectively trying to avoid cargo culting.
It's such a remarkable observation. No, absolutely right. In fact, just like in the Phoenix Project, the word DevOps is in the subtitle, but it's actually used only once in the book, maybe twice. And in the same way in this book, we actually wanted to avoid a lot of descriptions of current toolkits because they're so laden with meaning, right? So, intentional or unintentional. And we really try to stick with first principles. In fact, for our purposes, we really want to establish what are the first principles and really prove to ourselves that, just like in physics, you learn about F equals ma, and then you can actually, just by using that equation, do like interstellar, probe planning, right? You can actually predict where they're going to be without adding to it. And so we just want to come up with that very parsimonious set of principles that can explain the most. And so, I think a way that we did that is avoiding, a lot of current terms, even having a manufacturer term. But then in the case studies, we did, I think use a little bit more recognizable terms like, modularization, information hiding and so forth. But, something I'm just really pleased by, and something I just actually frankly amazed by, is that, the couch metaphor. We can explain two things that might be mutually exclusive. That seems mutually exclusive. Like, on the one hand, the couch can explain Amazon in 2001, where basically you had a very tightly coupled system where, small changes could basically take the entire site down for days. And it explains why, explains why they had lost their independence of action, right? In order to get small changes done, each engineer had to communicate and coordinate with 60, 80, hundreds of different teams. And so by partitioning, the system into microservices, they modularize the system, creating independence of action for, the you build it, you run it teams. Okay, fantastic. That couch was now subdivided into hundreds or thousands of couches. But, there's this other story, right, that Amazon Prime Video came out with last year, saying they went from microservices and step functions to a monolith. And so I think the couch also explains that, is that, when you chop the couch into too many small pieces, right, you spend all your time coordinating and transporting data in and out of storage buckets. And so you've lost coherence and locality. And so by gluing the couches back together again, right, you don't need to transport anymore. And so you kind of regain coherence and increase coupling. So I just thought that was, we don't have to, these simple metaphors, can explain what seem like contradictory, advice. We can describe the problems that led to them. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think so. And I think also, I think we get very stuck as an industry into this idea that, this approach is the right approach. And so often it depends where you are. So with like microservices, if you're evolving really quickly and your product is changing really quickly, then having lots of independently deployable services makes a bunch of sense. But you are paying a heavy operational cost for them. It's harder to, if something goes wrong, it's harder to track that out and debug it. Versus if you've got something that is more monolithic, yes, you can't evolve it as quicker, but it's a lot easier to run. So it can be a case where if your product is stable and not going to change, actually, a monolith might be a perfectly reasonable approach to that, particularly if you can sort of modularize that a bit within the actual programming environment. Yeah. That could be a perfectly valid approach. And moving from one to the other, I think we get very hung up on this. Oh, there's, like the one right way to do everything. And there isn't.
Yeah, in fact, and I just love the couch because it says, the decisions and the trade-offs you're making are around coupling and independence of action and coherence, right? To what degree can they all act together as a unified whole? And like in general, like if everything's in one application, it's a little bit easier to understand because it's actually part of a unified whole versus like thousands of microservices. Try understanding the context of all those in your head, right? It's very, very difficult.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Before we close, I really want to talk a little bit about the Unicorn Project book as well. We've touched on it a couple of times, but again, I think it had, one of the things I think is really interesting about it is it had such a profound impact on how leaders outside of technology think about their technology teams. And I don't know many books that have done that. I wonder if you could just, talk a little bit about the book and maybe share some of the stories you've heard from readers of it.
Yeah, in fact, thank you for the kind words on that. I love hearing that because if we can, as a fellow writer, I'd love to share kind of a writer horror story. So in the Phoenix Project, in the book, the most important question is like, who is the audience, right? And in the Phoenix Project, our first cut was like it's the top technology leader, the CIO, but and there were reasons for that. But ultimately, there was a whole bunch of scenes that didn't fit. And we basically at the very last 3 months of the project, we said, all right, it's not for the CIO, it's not for the CIO's boss, it's for the VP of IT operations, right? It's for them, and hopefully the book will be good enough where that person spreads the book around. And I think that was the right call. With the Unicorn Project, we had a similar quandary. In literally the last week of the book before it went to print, it was like, okay, who is this? Who is the audience? Is it for the dev leader? Is it a top technology leader? Is it a developer? And because we were having to, like, some jokes just wouldn't make sense to anyone but a developer. And do we really need to explain what an IDE is? And like, and finally, the decision, we made a decision. It's like, it's for the developer. And hopefully the book will be good enough that a developer will read it and sort of get something out of it. And I just think it shows just the power of whether the products or a book, just be very specific, like who the audience is, and just wrap everything subordinates to that. Mick Kirsten, who wrote the Project to Product book, he's CTO at PlanView now, he said when he deals with CEOs who want to know more about coding, he said, don't learn Python, just read the Unicorn Project, because it will give you a good glimpse of a day in the life of a developer and all the things that leaders can do to make the work miserable or impossible, versus like what makes it full of focus, flow, and joy, where they can actually move the needle on important outcomes. It was such I had mentioned before, it was such a incredible thought experiment just to sort of like sheep on the problems. On Maxine, the protagonist, is like, okay, what are the craziest things I've heard of people having to put up with, right, to do their daily work? And I'm hoping that it was very accessible to people, that you don't have to be a developer to understand that.
Yeah, no, I really think it. I really think it was, and I think as well the fact that it's it's a story. It's not a dry, sort of boring book, which so many are. It's just fun to read. I like genuine laugh out loud moments, which is not something that comes up in a management textbook. How did you say the sort of core of the book is the 5 ideals? So we've touched on a couple of them. Psychological safety is the fourth. Locality and simplicity is the first. Focus, flow, and joy, improvement of daily work, and customer focus. How did you arrive at those and select those?
Honest answer, again, from writer to writer, I was actually hanging out with Mick Kirsten, and we were visiting someone we just both mutually admired, the CEO of CompuWare, who was this amazing turnaround of a mainframe software vendor. Anyway, I met them for dinner the previous night. This is January 2019. They're like, "How's it going?" I'm like, "Terrible." I wrote 110,000 words, and I have no idea what it's about. But by the end of the next day, I just seen enough where I have a picture of the piece of paper where it just by the way Chris O'Malley, the CompuWare CEO at the time, talked, and just the rituals and norms they had in the organization, and it was just so obvious like what the book was about. It was those 5 things. It was locality and simplicity. Hang on. Reload the head. Locality, simplicity, focus, flow, and joy, improving daily work, psychological safety, and customer focus. And anyways, it's amazing how in 24 hours, if you have the right 24 hours, like what was just a muddled mess simply becomes clear. And then really, then the work became cutting out anything that didn't have to do with those 5 ideals, right? That was the work of many months. So true story.
Your writing process sounds horrifyingly like my writing process. So just, I was throwing a lot of words to the screen and then going, right, what do I have here?
I was listening to Tim Ferriss's interview of Jerry Seinfeld, and he said, comedy is a game of tonnage.
I also like there's a Neil Gaiman quote, which I also really love, which is doing your second draft is the opportunity you have to pretend you knew what you were doing all along. Which I also just really like. What are you currently working on? What are you thinking about at the moment?
Oh my goodness. What am I thinking about at the moment? I had before this, I was mentioning that I'm just still, I feel like writing the book was such an intellectual, not grind. It was the toughest thing I've ever worked on. And, I wish we could have had a year more to work on it. But you know what? I find myself so invigorated because I find myself now reading other books. I'm like, this is, what, if we use a Wiring to Winning Organization book language, right, this is what the lessons are. And so I'm going through some of my favorite books and just kind of reviewing it through kind of the simpler set of mechanisms. And I'm just finding it just so exciting. For example, when I read the Google leaked memo. We have no moat, and neither does OpenAI. For me, it was just it reminded me of like the lessons about modularization, and so basically, kind of the gist of the paper is, the reason why they don't have a moat is that these cheaper, smaller LLMs. That's where the frontier. You can solve those parts of the frontier with those smaller models, and you don't need $100 million to create these frontier foundational models. And so what I learned in the book is that, well, it depends on where you think the tough problems are. Are they in this vast frontier that one small team can't explore by themselves, right? And that would say, oh, so the open source models. Or are there still genuinely tough problems that you still need $100 million to like train, right? And I think the answer is very much both. I'm not an expert. I can't prognosticate, but it's given me the language and the thought process to be able to look at a thing of which I know nothing about, despite hundreds of hours of videos watched, and not really come to an opinion yet, but be able to say, oh, how, where you put your bets it will depend on these things. And so that's been so satisfying. So I see myself spending the next, couple of years just, kind of revisiting some of these concepts and kind of reframing some of my favorite works, through the lens of the tools and terminology in the wiring book.
That's fantastic. Gene, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to me today.
Oh, Charles, right back at you. I'm a fan of your work. I loved your GoToCon video. And so keep up the great work. I can't wait till these series comes out. Not for me, but for the people that you're interviewing, including Elizabeth Hendrickson.
Thank you so much.